In this video, you're going to learn 5 alternatives for worship team devotionals, something different than just sitting down and reading through a devotional with your team. Those are great, but there are also 5 other things that you can start incorporating into your worship rehearsals to switch it up every once in a while. Coming up. Hey, Spencer here from leadingworshipwell.com. This is the place where we talk about how to lead yourself well, lead your church well, and lead worship well. In this video, we're going to be talking about worship team devotionals, at least that worship team devotional time. If you know me at all, you know that I love worship team devotionals. In fact, I even put together a subscription where I will send you a new worship team devotional every single week. So I'll link that down in the description below. But while I love them, and I think that they're probably the best way to lead your team spiritually, I think that it benefits us to switch it up every once in a while. And maybe you don't do I'm going to sit down and read a devotional and teach my team for 15 minutes. You don't do that every single week, but you incorporate some of these ideas that I'm about to talk about and replace them in your worship team devotional time that you normally have at your rehearsal so that it keeps things fresh and exciting. So those are what we're going to be talking about today. There's 5 things that you can incorporate to keep things fresh and exciting in your worship rehearsal. Speaking of worship rehearsals, if you haven't yet checked out the worship rehearsal blueprint that I put together, check that out down in the description below. It's a complete plan for you to have the best worship team rehearsal you've ever had, where you can lead your team well spiritually, relationally, and musically. And of course, a devotional time is part of that blueprint. So check that out down in the description below. But let's get into it. What are these 5 things that you can substitute instead of having a normal worship team devotional time? Just a caveat before we get into these 5 things is I do believe that worship team devotionals are pretty much a necessity for leading your team spiritually. I think they're the best way to make sure that your team is led spiritually every single week, and there's constant development spiritually, because we aren't just a band, we aren't just getting together to play some songs. We want to be a group of worship leaders, and we want to be growing in our faith. So devotionals are the best way to do that, a regular rhythm of worship team devotionals. But that doesn't mean that you have to do it 52 weeks out of the year. You can substitute some of these things I'm about to talk about into your worship rehearsals, and maybe one week you don't do a standard devotional. So those are what we're talking about. Let's get into the first one. And the first thing that you can do instead of doing a standard 10 to 15 minute worship team devotional is you can listen to a new song. Do you have a song that you want to introduce to your church? Well, if you want to introduce it to your church, your team needs to learn it first. And yes, obviously, we send out a link to our team and say, hey, we're going to be learning this, or we're going to be leading this song in 2 or 3 weeks, so we need to start learning it. And so they listen to it on their own, but there's something special that happens when you sit together with your team and listen to it together. So what if, instead of a worship team devotional one week at your worship rehearsal, you just turned on that new song and said, hey, we're going to be introducing this song to our church, and I want us to listen to it together first, and then we're going to go over it later in our worship rehearsal. Or what if you just had them worship to it? And they just sat there and listened to a new song and worshiped through it before they actually led your church in worshiping by using that song. I mean, that would be a great time of growth, wouldn't it be? So you could do that. You could have them worship through it, or you could have them listen to it and just ask them, say, hey, I want you to listen for your specific instrumental part here. If you play guitar, listen to the guitar. If you play drums, listen to the drums, so on and so forth. And I want you to listen for when they come in, when they cut out, and what they play. And that would help them grow musically, which is also an area that sometimes we miss out on as a worship team. Remember, there's 3 areas of worship team growth. There is the Spiritual, which is covered by our worship team devotionals usually. There is the relational, where we get to know our teammates better. And then there is also the musical. And yes, we play music all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are improving in our musicianship. So you can use that devotional time to improve your musicianship. So you can do that by listening to a new song that you're about to introduce to your church. So that first way was a way to improve musically. How else can you improve spiritually or develop spiritually? Apart from strong, solid teaching in a worship team devotional, what if you just took an extended time of prayer? And you took 10 or 15 minutes to diligently pray for your church. And maybe, I'm guessing that probably most of your worship team members, maybe that's unfair, but I think a lot of worship team members probably haven't just sat down and solidly prayed for 10 or 15 minutes at a time. I think for a lot of us as Christians, like our prayers are like 5 minutes long, and that's our maximum length. So what if we taught our team to pray for longer, and you led them through an extended time of prayer and said, hey team, I know we usually pray for like 30 seconds before we get on stage, and then maybe for 5 minutes at the end of our worship rehearsal. Instead of doing a devotional this week, I just want us to spend some time in focused prayer, and we are going to focus on praying for this specific thing or these specific things. And maybe you have them go sit out in your worship space in different sections, and in that time they're spending 10 minutes praying for the people who are going to be sitting in that section on Sunday. And you get them to picture the people in their head. I mean, people have like assigned seats in church, right? So you always know who's sitting in a specific section, and you just pray for those people, and you pray for them how they're living their lives during the week, and then you pray for them when they come on Sunday, that God would speak to them, that they would be able to focus on celebrating the worthiness of God. Like, wouldn't that be a powerful exercise for your church or for your worship team to do? So you could have an extended time of prayer and substitute your normal worship team devotional for an extended time of prayer. Number 3, staying focused on the spiritual side of development. And I kind of touched on this earlier, but what if your team just had the opportunity to worship? What if you spent 10 or 15 minutes, that would be like 2 or 3 songs, where they could just worship? I think a lot of worship team members miss out on being able to freely worship. And obviously there's other forms of worship. So I'm not saying like they never worship. I think what we do on stage on Sunday mornings is worship, even if we have other responsibilities that we're thinking about. That is definitely worship. But just that freedom of worship where we don't have any responsibilities and we can just focus on God in a corporate setting. Obviously, your team should be doing that throughout the week on their own, but just, you know what I'm talking about. The typical, what people think of when they think of worship, even though it's not the correct thought of what worship actually is, but, being in your church and singing. Your team doesn't get that opportunity very often because they're the ones leading worship. And so what if you gave them that opportunity? And you said, instead of our worship team devotionals, we're going to take 10 to 15 minutes to just worship through these 2 songs. Maybe you pick some songs that your team knows really well, and they just have the opportunity. They aren't playing along with you. You are just leading them in worship. That would help them develop spiritually. And maybe you're doing those 2 songs this Sunday, and now they've had the opportunity to go on the journey that those 2 songs provide before they actually lead people on the journey. So it would improve their worship leading for Sunday as well. I mean, that would be amazing, right? So give your team time to worship. That's another thing you can substitute for your worship team devotional time. All right, number 4. This is one of my favorite exercises. I used to do this all the time before I started writing worship team devotionals, and I still love to come back to this every once in a while, and that is just to ask a question. Instead of we're going to sit down and read and learn from a worship team devotional, what if you just threw out a question for discussion? Think how that would get people engaged in discussion, right? And just a few examples of these questions. You could ask, what's been the most significant moment we've had in worship over the past year? Think about that for your church. Like, have there been any special moments in our church? Like, what has been super powerful for our church in corporate worship over the past year? And you'll get different responses from different people, and then you can use that information to set up those sorts of moments again so that you can continue to lead your church well. So you get input from your team, you get them thinking about, I'm not here to just play songs, but I'm here to lead worship, and then you get some information that's helpful for you in your planning. So that's a question you could ask. You could ask a fun question like, hey, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a new worship team member? And that gets them thinking, like, what have I learned about being on the worship team? And you get those wheels turning in their head. And then they're also speaking encouragement and truth to each other as they give advice to a hypothetical new worship team member, but they're also really giving advice to each other. So that's a powerful way to resource people on your team. One more question is just, what's going on in the life of our church right now? And you get them thinking, you get your worship team thinking about the people in your church, what's going on in their lives. They probably know different people than you know in your church, and so you get to hear some of those stories, and you get them thinking about, and the follow-up question would be, okay, how are the songs that we're leading this Sunday? How do they speak into those situations? So you get them thinking through that process, and we aren't just leading songs, but we are leading songs directly into the lives of the people of our church. So you could just ask a simple question like that and probably talk about it for longer than 10 or 15 minutes, but at least 10 or 15 minutes. And finally, number 5, the fifth thing you could substitute for your typical worship team devotional time. So far we've talked about the musical piece, we've talked about the spiritual piece. This is the relational piece. What if you just hang out with your team? What if people come in and you've usually been following the worship rehearsal blueprint where you start with a worship team devotional to get your team in the right mindset, but instead of that, you just say, how's everybody's week going? How are you doing? What's new in your life? What's going on? And you just have a casual conversation for 10 or 15 minutes. Maybe you've been missing out on that with your team, and your team needs to have that time where they can just talk and be together. I know not every worship team needs that, but I think probably a lot more do than we think. Maybe you don't even realize that you need that time. But think back, like, have you just been focused on, I have this plan for my worship team, and we need to run through the songs for Sunday, and we need to do a devotional time, and we need to pray. All of those things are important, but have you ever taken the time to just be a group of believers who gather together? It's okay to sacrifice some of your worship team devotional time for those moments where you're just hanging out. You can just hang out, have a casual conversation. I'm not saying to make that all you ever do, but every once in a while, just get to know the people of your team at a worship rehearsal, and it'll have massive benefits for you as you develop your team relationally. So there they were, 5 things that you can do and substitute out for that worship team devotional time. Once again, if you need help with your worship team rehearsals, which is when you typically do a worship team devotional, I've got something for you. It's linked down in the description below. It's the worship rehearsal blueprint that I put together. It's a complete plan for leading the perfect worship rehearsal that will lead your team well, not just musically, so they know the songs for Sunday, but spiritually, and relationally as well. So check that out down in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.